Of chapter 9, the 12 disciples being sent out to preach and to heal. They were given power from Christ to be able to do this, and they did so successfully. We see again the miracle of the feeding of the 5,000 and all of that entailed. We've seen a challenge for people to follow him, and even some of the revealing of Christ's life and what's going to happen with the telling of his death. And then we saw the transfiguration of Christ. And what took place as he had his glory revealed to three of his disciples as he was praying and he met with Moses and Elijah. And some of the lessons that went with that, which brought us to where we were last week. And last week, we were looking at the possessed boy who was healed, and particularly Jesus healing this possessed boy. And this was really a tale of two faiths, is what we kind of titled it as and looked at, because we saw two contrasting types of faith. We saw the faith of the disciples. We also saw the faith of the Father. That's not the order that we looked at. We first looked at the faith of the Father. And what happened was that as Jesus came down with Peter, James, and John from praying, and they returned in the multitude, and there was a man who caught their attention. And this man caught their attention because he had a son, his only child, who was suffering from seizures. Now, the man recognized that these seizures were not what we would consider natural seizures, like epileptic seizures, but rather these seizures were caused by demonic possession. The son was possessed by a demon. It was causing him to seize in this way. But not only that, he was also being thrown to the ground and being hurt in this manner, bruised and dashed and things of that nature. So this man was desperate. He didn't turn to modern medicine of the day. He didn't turn to superstitious methods, but rather he turned in faith to the source in which he believed could actually help him in this situation. Now, it's interesting that Jesus actually wasn't the first one that he turned to, which in many times we have highlighted that we should turn to Jesus, but actually his faith was strong to the point that he first went to Jesus' disciples. Now remember, we highlighted at the beginning of chapter 9 that his disciples were given power to do this. So this wasn't a wrong place for him to turn. Rather, this was a place where he absolutely could and probably should have turned. But the issue was, the disciples were not able to heal his son. They were not able to cast out these demons. So this father's faith persisted. He didn't just give up and say, well, I guess if these disciples can't do it, then nobody can, and I guess he's just stuck like this, and that's going to be his life, and we're going to deal with it. But rather, he was persistent in his faith and pursued Jesus. And Jesus had grace and mercy upon him and his son, and he heals this boy and casts out these demons, and he was completely healed in this manner. But then Jesus gives a sharp statement. He says, O faithless and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you and suffer you? And then he says, bring thy son hither. Now, this first question was not given to the masses of people. That's not who Jesus was pointing this question at, but rather he was pointing this question at his disciples, which is why we see the contrasting faiths. We see the faith of this father, which was strong in Jesus and the ability that he gave his disciples. But then we see the disciples' faith, which Jesus here is describing as perverse and faithless. So lacking faith and was indeed perverse. Now, why was this the case? Well, it all stems back to their inability to cast out these demons. Something happened between the beginning of chapter 9 and their success in being able to do this, and then their failure of being able to do this later. And Jesus' statement is what shows what changed, and it was their faith. When they were successful in their ministry, their faith was completely in God to be able to do these works. But now that they've had success in doing so, they stopped having faith in God to be able to do these things, and they started having more faith in their own ability to do these things, which caused them to fail because it wasn't their power that was accomplishing it, but rather it was the power that was given to them by Christ. So their faith had failed because their faith turned from the one in whom they were supposed to show their faith. They were supposed to put their faith in God, but that turned into faith into themselves, which caused their failure. Now, some of this could have been due to some confusion, again, from Christ saying that he was going to die. Because there was, again, the idea that the Messiah was going to set up his earthly kingdom, in which he will. They believed Jesus to be the Messiah, but they couldn't get in their heads that it wasn't that this time. So even some of that doubt could have crept in that could have caused this, because again, the only 3 disciples that saw the glory of Christ and were able to start reconciling that he is indeed the Messiah and that yes, he is going to die, would have potentially been Peter, James, and John, because they saw this in the Transfiguration. But the rest of them didn't see this. Jesus then tells them once again about how he is going to die. But this time, he is doing so in a way that they don't understand in the moment. And this revealed for us that God gives us what we need when we need it. God did not reveal the meaning of what Jesus said at this moment because the disciples didn't need it at this time, but they would need it later. So that will come into play later when we look at the disciples' life as we continue the book of Luke. But then this brings us to where we are this morning. And this morning is a very interesting passage. And I find it interesting based off of everything that has just taken place. Now, the kind of preview, you can probably kind of read through, we're going to be looking at verses 46 through 50 this morning. But the disciples are probably acting about as human as you can act after being rebuked. Now, typically, we would like to believe that once we are rebuked or we are corrected, that we show some level of humility, right? And try to correct based off of what we've been rebuked. We would like to. We would like to think that that's what happens, but so often with the human heart, this doesn't happen, but rather we somehow fill with pride very quickly after a rebuke. You would think after the disciples' rebuke of their faith, they would show humility, but this morning we're going to look at that they did about as opposite as you could do. So this morning we're going to be looking at 3 points from verses 46 through 50, with our first point being a bold assumption.